The musicals of the 1970s. Oh, sorry, wrong decade. I meant this clip. By the 1970s, films like Rocky Horror Picture Show, Tommy, and The Roads had replaced the good old family fun of The Sound of Music. Rock music had been creeping into the scene for quite some time now, and the musical became unrecognizable. Out was the big-budget spectacle musical, and in was new music, new stories, and a loss of nuclear family values. Here is the tale of how movie musicals emerged out of the late 1960s into something new, exciting, and sometimes strange. Welcome to Movie Musical Mania. Today we discuss all the changes that musicals went through throughout the 1970s. Please like and subscribe for more content like this. Let's get into it. In a recent video, I argued that the movie musical died in the late 1960s after a string of box office flops. After these big-budget spectacles failed to recoup investments or garner audiences' praise, studios found themselves making these prestige films less and less. Simply put, tastes had changed. As several people noted in the comments of that video, musicals were still around in the 1970s. This is undoubtedly true, but they looked completely different. Musicals no longer held the place of prestige that they had in the 1940s and 1950s. It was more of an echo of a bygone era, and musicals would really never experience this hype again. Musicals underwent a dramatic shift in the 1970s, and two main types emerged: the traditional and the innovative. With any art form or genre that fades away, there are going to be plenty of people that hold on to the past. I would first like to examine these films that tried to replicate the traditional movie musicals which had worked so well in the past. While some of the following films were received well financially or by critics, most of them seemed quite out of touch with the times. So, here are the musicals that rejected the new way of doing things and cherished an older ideology. Starting off the decade strong with On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, starring Barbra Streisand, which was adapted from the Burton Lane Alan J. Lerner musical of the same title, tells the story of a girl who discovers, with the help of a psychiatrist, that she led a previous life in the 18th century. Bearing little resemblance to its stage counterpart, this film is considerable if only for Barbra Streisand, Jack Nicholson, and the fact that it's one of Vincent Minnelli's final films. It received mixed reviews with praise for the charming songs, but dislike for the long and slow script. The film is certainly built on an interesting concept, but manages to fall flat several times, with long gaps between the musical numbers. After the opening number and the credits, the second number in the show, called Love with All the Trimmings, doesn't happen for over a half hour. Jerry Herman's smash Mame was inevitably going to reach the screen, but instead of Broadway's Angela Lansbury, Lucille Ball played the titular role of Mame instead. Her singing is coarse, and her shots are all taken with such an extreme soft focus that it looks as if Vaseline had been spread on the camera lens. If the movie is worth watching, it is for B. Arthur, who absolutely kills it and is the best part of the movie.
I have an astronomical discovery for you. The man in the moon is a bitch!
1971's Fiddler on the Roof is a beautiful and heart-wrenching film. Norman Jewison's love for the stage show is evident, but he also is able to make it cinematic. Topol plays a wonderful and lovable Tevye. The village of Anatevka feels real with its color palette of muted browns and oranges. As the film progresses, winter comes and tradition fades away. The film grows darker, colder, and desolate. On top of all of this, it has beautiful, lush orchestrations by John Williams. I wish he did more musicals. Truly, in my opinion, this is one of the greatest screen musicals of all time. 1975's Funny Lady was the sequel to Funny Girl, with Barbra Streisand returning as Fanny Brice. This film took on a darker tone than the original Funny Girl, as it recounted Fanny's fading popularity in the 1930s and her tumultuous relationship with Billy Rose, played by James Caan. Several critics called the movie messy and uninspired, but everyone agrees that Streisand can't miss as Fanny. In the late 1970s, we got New York, New York, with Liza Minnelli and Robert De Niro, directed by Martin Scorsese. It recounted the big band era from the 1940s and was a spectacle film that, reportedly, originally ran over 4 hours. Then, of course, there was plenty of children's musicals during this time, like Willy Wonka, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and The Little Prince. Other notable films to mention from this period are 1776, Man of La Mancha, Lost Horizon, Song of Norway, At Long Last Love. There's plenty of examples, and I can't wait to cover them in further detail in later videos. While some of these films are appreciated now, at the time they were a little too trite or too saccharine. In layman's terms, they weren't hip enough. So, what was going on? Get ready for what I like to call a little film history crash course. In the 30s and 40s, movie studios operated like clockwork, almost like movie-making machines. All the work was centralized, and everything, including sometimes distribution, was controlled by the studios. This is called Fordism. Everyone who worked on the set had a highly specified role that they were a master in. This is a method that was spearheaded by the engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor-Witch, so we'll call it Taylorism. I know it's a lot of terms, but all that matters is it was a highly specified team that made little mistakes. This had its benefits, like how the Arthur Freed unit at MGM pumped out high-quality musicals with roughly the same creative team behind almost every picture. But it also created a hierarchy where only a few stories made it to the mainstream, hence a lack of diversity in popular culture. Following the Paramount case in 1948, which ruled that movie studios couldn't block book movie theaters with their films or own the movie theaters themselves, Fordist practices petered out and New Hollywood was born. In addition to this, the restrictive Hays Code was lifted in 1968. In this post-Fordism, post-Taylorism, post-Hays Code movie industry, people often found themselves taking several roles on a film set and fighting less of an established hierarchy. The greatest benefit of this was greater flexibility, diversity, and freedom on the screen, and a little less typecasting. That is the end of Film History Crash Course. Family musicals had once reinforced happy American, often Christian values. You know, the happy-go-lucky sing until we fix our problems, Judy and Mickey save the day kind of deal. Idyllic. Wholesome. Utopic. By the 1970s, musicals were free to represent more social conflicts around sex, gender, war, social unrest, and drug use. And in essence, the era reflected a feeling of disillusionment with the government and wars and the nuclear family. Ethan Mordden writes in Hollywood Musicals, "In the heyday of the Hollywood musicals, in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s, we took for granted that movie characters were sexually monogamous, patriotic, and like most people in their perceptions, whereas singers of rock are wired into a subculture that is sexually promiscuous, anarchic, and countercultural." He hit the nail on the head. We can't discuss the musicals in the 1970s without first talking about the importance of rock and the generation that embraced it. In American Film Musical Themes and Forms, Michael Dunn writes that rock and roll culture, which had been growing exponentially in the youth population, threatened the status quo of Rodgers and Hart era show tunes and the musicals which showcased them. In that way, rock music threatened musicals altogether. Classic original musicals faded out and were replaced by extravagant adaptations of Broadway shows, which were considered safer. Traditional show tunes fell from the charts with the exception of a few Hello Dollies or Sunrise Sunsets. It seemed that the movie musical had two choices: accept rock and roll, or die fighting it. So we got the Elvis movies in the 1950s and the Frankie Avalon beach party movies with shoehorned in songs and a plot suitable for a drive-in movie date. Michael Dunn and Ethan Mordden both state in their respective works that Bye Bye Birdie in 1963 is one of the first movie musicals to employ rock effectively, and only a few numbers even have a rock sound. The plot, which is centered around an Elvis Presley-inspired Conrad Birdie who has been drafted into the Army, has appeal for both adults and teenagers. The film partially responded to claims of teenage rebellion in response to rock and roll's popularity, but it makes a joke of teenagers' love for rock and roll. When the girls faint around Conrad Birdie's feet, they exhibit no real sexual desire, but the joke is that they were young, impressionable, and no threat. The message might be that this rock obsession was harmless and frivolous. Michael Dunn writes in American Film Musical Themes and Forms, Anne Margaret has certainly been hired for her sex appeal, but the 15-year-old character is presented as childish and pre-sexual. This sexual innocence is signaled by her Flintstone dolls and by her fuzzy bedroom slippers and cutely askew ball cap with which she finishes her outfit. If this is her idea of what it means to be a woman, then her parents, and the parents in the audience, have nothing to worry about kids today, despite their professed fondness for rock and roll music. Remember this part for later. The Beatles crashed onto the screen in Hard Day's Night and Help, with the score comprised of Beatles hits. The first is usually considered better than the second. Paul McCartney himself admits that they approached the second film with less enthusiasm and as more of a joke, and that none of them bothered to learn the script. By the time the 1970s rolled around, rock music was not only embraced in films, but oftentimes it was expected. Concert films like Woodstock, Gimme Shelter, and The Last Waltz were very popular, where there was no narrative, but it was just a recorded concert. This time also gave rise to movies that had music that commented on the action, instead of being inherently musical. like FM and Saturday Night Fever, which were perfect vehicles for selling soundtrack albums that made a lot of money. Soundtrack sales also led to jukebox musicals, like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton featuring the music from the Beatles' album Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road. Rock and Roll High School is a hodgepodge of music by the Ramones and other popular performers, and a little like one long music video. The ideology behind rock musicals was different and foreign than what had come before. Kelly Kessler writes in Disabling the Hollywood Musical that these new musicals shadowed the utopic focus of a central couple's romance to other themes, such as manhood, religion, or corruption. They were often pessimistic about romance, as well as rebellious and seemingly dangerous to the status quo. Perhaps the best example is 1975's Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was not afraid to test the limits of what was palatable to an audience. Indeed, describing the plot to someone who hasn't seen it can be a harrowing event. Tim Curry's own agent advised him against taking the role, seeing it as a death sentence to his career. While not an immediate success, its tremendous fanbase, shadowcast showings, and cult classic status has cemented it in history. Bette Midler made her screen debut in 1979's The Rose, a vague biopic of Janis Joplin. This film, set in the 1960s, addressed the changing ideology of America, which perhaps was shown best by the troubled and unpredictable Rose. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, goes a chant in the film, before Rose dies from a heroin overdose on stage, ending any chance of a happy resolution to her romance with a soldier. 1976, A Star is Born, with Barbra Streisand and Kris Kristofferson, took the old formula from the 1937 and 1954 films and turned the classic Hollywood doomed romance into the world of rock. Instead of rising and plummeting movie stars, now Esther and Norman are rock stars, an ingenious touch by the studio to keep the movie relevant. These films were ready to take on new subjects or address familiar ones in new ways. Similarly to The Sound of Music, Cabaret talks about the rise of the Nazis, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. While not a rock musical, Cabaret still reflects the cinematic ideology of the time. It's gritty and it's real. The Sound of Music is squeaky clean, and the Nazis seem like an afterthought saved for the third act. Cabaret not only unravels the Nazis' takeover slowly, but also discusses masculinity and what it means to be a gay man, abortion, Sally's seemingly free and untrappable spirit that is trapped by commitment issues, and anti-Semitism.
She wouldn't look Jewish at all.
Bob Fosse's masterpiece adapted the stage show to be truly cinematic. The songs, save one, are all stuck on the stage, which makes the Kit Kat Club Cabaret seem otherworldly. One might think that this world simply comments on the outside problems and is never infiltrated itself, but as the viewer discovers in the final shot, the Nazis inevitably take over. Bob Fosse's Best Director Oscar for this film was a much-needed recognition of his stressful and manic relationship with show business, which would be reflected in his biopic-like 1979 All That Jazz. The film is the story of a choreographer and director working in both Hollywood and on the stage, and, in a heightened state of stress, experiences a heart attack and dies. This was inspired by Fosse's own heart attack in the fall of 1974, while he was simultaneously editing Lenny for Hollywood and rehearsing Chicago for Broadway. While he survived this one, another heart attack would kill him in 1987. 1975's Tommy, a rock opera based on The Who's album, discusses trauma and violence among other things in a mind-bending surrealist world. Warped perceptions of truth and evil are driving forces of the narrative, and abandoned wholesome romances or relationships for a story of trauma. The story revolves around Tommy, a boy who is deaf and blind and is maltreated by his family. This isn't Oliver, folks. This is a psychedelic nightmare. Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar both were told stories of Jesus Christ with their own modern twist, and The Wiz revisited the old Oz tale but from a modern sound and an all-black cast. I lump these three films together due to their innovation, particularly with space. Godspell marketed itself as the gospel of today and is fittingly strange with a cast of disciples in clown makeup in Manhattan. Jesus Christ Superstar combines the hippie era with the age of Jesus and provides striking visuals, like the cross being carried on a bus. And The Wiz plops Dorothy into a dystopic New York City version of Oz. 1979's Hair was an anti-war film that came out 4 years after the war had ended. Its message of peace during the Vietnam War had expired upon the time of its release. What was the point? And lastly, the 1978 smash Grease embraced the campiness of rock and the nostalgia of earlier years. It brought back the utopic couple gets together in the end and let's sing and dance and fly into the clouds bit that many rock musicals tended to ditch. But in true rock musical fashion, the teenagers were taken a bit more seriously than they were in the past. Perhaps because they were all played by 30-year-olds. For example, Anne Margaret's Kim would never endure the pregnancy scare that Stockard Channing's Rizzo would. And this does not mean Grease is any more serious or important than Bye Bye Birdie is, but it does mean that movies were willing to address teenagers in at least a more significant light. To be honest, despite the appeal of Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta, I never understood why this particular film took off. Perhaps you can enlighten me in the comments. Changing tastes, music, and ideology caused the classic musical to die in exchange for rock-inspired musicals that were disillusioned with nuclear America. This resulted in some classic, original, and more than bizarre films. As a result of this new Hollywood, musicals were changed forever. This is Movie Musical Mania. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more content like this.